This is me at age 26, about to take on the biggest challenge of my life. You can't tell from the photo, but I was nervous, scared, overwhelmed, and if I'm being honest, a solid 20 pounds overweight. That morning I had woken up in Auckland, New Zealand, boarded a bus, traveled 7 hours north, and finally hitchhiked the last 70 miles to this lighthouse, the northernmost point in all of New Zealand. From there, I would hike 2,000 miles south down the entire length of the country, crossing snow-capped mountains, green glacial rivers, fields of tussock grass, desolate beaches, volcanic craters, and even the occasional town or city. I would do it alone, and I would sleep in a tiny little tent. Now, I know what you're thinking. What kind of lunatic flies halfway across the world just to sleep on the ground for 4 months? Didn't you have a job, and doesn't New Zealand have roads? I can't answer all those questions, but what I can say is that in that moment, standing there with 2,000 miles of trail in front of me, it all just seemed impossible. I took out my map to see just how far that 7-hour bus ride and that 70-mile hitchhike had taken me. Because in the moment, it sure seemed like we had covered a lot of ground. But it turns out we hadn't. I had a monumental amount of walking to do, about the same as walking from Georgia to New Hampshire, and I hadn't taken a single step in the right direction. And yet, 4 months later, there I was, standing next to a signpost that marked the southernmost tip of New Zealand and the end of my journey. I'd grown a massive beard, as you can tell, lost 30 pounds, and I'd learned something new about challenges that seem impossible. They aren't. We're often told to live in the moment. We're told to live in the moment by our friends, our parents, our yoga teachers. And typically they tell us to live in the moment thinking that it'll make us happy. And that's true, it does make us happy. But it does more than that. It helps us succeed by taking those big, impossible-seeming challenges and breaking them down. Having big goals to begin with, sure, that's important. That requires some long-term thinking and some foresight. But making those goals happen takes living in the moment by breaking those big, impossible-seeming challenges down into small, immediate steps. I quickly realized when I set out to hike New Zealand that I didn't have to hike the entire trail in one day. All I had to do was put one foot in front of the other, and eventually I would make it. Now, most people have big goals. Most people dream of doing something big and challenging and epic. But many people fail to turn those dreams into realities because the task at hand is too daunting, too overwhelming to even start. So I'll tell you a few stories of people who have taken this idea of big challenges down to small pieces and have used it to achieve extraordinary things, far more extraordinary than walking from point A to point B. If you've ever read Bill Bryson's A Short History of Nearly Everything, you'll likely remember the story of Rev Bob Evans. Evans is an amateur astronomer who hunts for supernovas in the night sky. A supernova is just a massive, distant star that's exploded and collapsed and appears in our night sky for about a month or so before it's gone forever. Astronomers like to find these things because they help us take measurements of the universe. The problem is they're notoriously difficult to find. There are 100,000 galaxies observable from Earth, and so finding one of these specks in the night is a bit like finding a grain of sand on the beach that wasn't there yesterday. In fact, they're so hard to find that no other astronomer has been able to find more than 10. And yet, Bob Evans, an amateur who's a trained minister with a small 16-inch telescope in his backyard, has been able to find 42. So how does he do it? Well, Evans is methodical, and he doesn't try to observe the entire universe in one night. He simply progresses from one galaxy to the next, working his way through the field charts of space. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody gave me a 16-inch telescope and told me to go find tiny specks of light in the night sky that weren't there yesterday, I'd tell them to go bug somebody else. But Evans has achieved great things. He's won prestigious medals, and he's made precious contributions to our understanding of the universe, all big achievements with the smallest of steps. Next, think about a skyscraper. More importantly, think about the act of building a skyscraper, as Atul Gawande noted in his book, The Checklist Manifesto. Think about how many different types of expertise it takes to put one of these things up. There are structural engineers and architects. There are crane operators and concrete pourers and bricklayers and electricians and plumbers and carpenters and landscapers. It takes so many different types of expertise and is so complicated and intricate that it couldn't possibly fit inside the head of one person. And yet, go to any job site, even one for a 100-story tower like this, and you will find one person whose sole task it is to manage the entire process. So how do they do it? Well, it's simple. They take this big, impossible-seeming challenge, and they break it down into a series of glorified to-do lists. This is what we're going to do today. This is what we're going to do tomorrow. This needs to happen before that. And so on until the project starts to seem achievable. And one by one, those boxes get checked. And slowly, the building gets put up. So this idea of big accomplishments through small steps, it shows up everywhere. Software development teams use a process called Agile to break big, ugly software development projects down into more manageable chunks called sprints. And they use this process to develop better software and to do it faster. The greatest football coach of all time, Bill Belichick. He almost never talks about winning the Super Bowl, and yet he's won more of them than any other coach in history. He directs his players not to think about the Super Bowl either, but to focus on one game at a time, one quarter at a time, one play at a time. And you know that Andy Dufresne in The Shawshank Redemption did not break out of prison in one day. He scraped his way out with a tiny little rock hammer for 19 years. Big accomplishment, small steps. So it's an idea that shows up in a lot of different places, but putting it into practice requires a few mindset shifts. So I'll go through 3 of those. First, shift your focus from the long term to focusing on the present. Do this by engaging in mindfulness exercises like yoga or meditation. For me, it's actually often skiing, because when I'm careening down the mountain at speeds that would make my mom incredibly nervous, I can't think about anything else. I'm truly living in the present. Second, shift from a mindset that values the ability to multitask to one that values the ability to focus on one thing at a time. Do this by organizing your life into a series of to-do lists. It helps mitigate complexity and get things done. And third, shift from the traditional mindset that you should strive for success and happiness will follow. Reverse that. Strive for happiness and know that success will follow. Do this by trying a daily gratitude journal. It's a simple idea. You wake up in the morning or before you go to bed at night, just write down 1 or 2 things that you're grateful for. That simple act creates a virtuous cycle of positivity and optimism that it takes to take that first step. Focus on the present, one thing at a time. Strive for happiness. I still remember those first few weeks on the hike when I hit my low point. I'd been trudging through steep, dense, muddy jungle for several days in unrelentingly pouring rain. I was exhausted. My so-called waterproof gear was soaked through. I was 100% convinced I had trench foot. My feet were disgusting and covered in blisters. I was frustrated. I was tired. I was alone. I had barely put a dent into those 2,000 miles. And yes, I was still fat and still out of shape. But at that moment, I made a resolution. I made a resolution that would save me. It became my mantra over the next few months that I would repeat over and over and over again in my head. Just keep going. I stopped bemoaning how far I had to go and worrying about how little ground I had covered. I just put one foot in front of the other, and eventually the impossible started to seem possible. Remember this: focus on the present. Do one thing at a time. Strive for happiness. And while you're at it, just keep going. Thank you.